Good evening. Thanks for being here. My name is Nadia Oliva. I'm a senior coordinator of adult learning here at TIFF Bell Lightbox. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the final event of this season's Books on Film, Jay Cox on the Age of Innocence. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge that tonight's event is taking place on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work within this space. It's been an absolute pleasure to watch all of these films with you and seen all of these conversations unfold on this stage this year. We hope that you'll join us next year for Books on Film 2019. We have a very busy summer of research ahead of us, and then we'll have more information on the upcoming lineup and films in December, so stay tuned. If you haven't had enough of Books on Film for this season, Jay is also joining us tomorrow to speak about his screenplay for Martin Scorsese's Silence, adapted from the novel of the same name by Shusaku Endo. So another adaptation tomorrow if you'd like to join us then. But tonight we're watching an earlier collaboration from this legendary pair, The Age of Innocence, in a stunning 4K digital restoration. On behalf of TIFF, I'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, the major public supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. We'd also like to thank our programming partner for the series, Penguin Random House Canada, our media partner, Star Metro Toronto, and our presenting partner, Warby Parker. Lastly, thank you to donors and members like yourselves for supporting TIFF's charitable mission of bringing the power of film to life 365 days a year. And again, we hope you join us next year as well. It's been wonderful to watch all of these films with you this season. Last but not least, a final reminder that Luma is still offering half-price bottles of wine every Books on Film night. This being the last, I hope you'll join me there so you can continue the conversation after the screening. And without further ado, for the final time this season, please join me in welcoming to the stage Eleanor Wachtel.
It's gone by very quickly. Welcome back to the final event of this season. Edith Wharton was born into a wealthy New York family in 1862 during the American Civil War. Her maiden name was Edith Newbold Jones, and in fact, the expression "keeping up with the Joneses" relates to her own family, her affluent aunts, who had one of whom had the first house in New York with a bathtub, and they also they started to move to live north of 42nd Street on the east side near the park, which was also considered quite adventurous. Wharton's family was part of the New York 400, an elite group whose number was determined by the capacity of Mrs. Vanderbilt's ballroom. Edith spent much of her early childhood in Europe, something that marked her forever as an outsider. She claimed that when she turned to New York at the age of 10, she never, quote, felt otherwise than as an exile in America. She remained a fierce critic of the constrained society that she found herself in, especially as imposed by her difficult mother. Her father died when she was 20. She had two older brothers, but she eventually became estranged from them later in life. She married Teddy Wharton when she was 23. He was 35. It turned out to be a disaster. Almost entirely sexless, Teddy became increasingly mentally unstable and at one point speculated recklessly with her money. They divorced in 1913, then she moved to France, and she lived there until her death in 1937. She apparently had only one other sexual relationship, and that was an affair with an unreliable bisexual journalist, Morton Fullerton. And I'm going into this much detail to give you a context for tonight's movie and the fate of its characters. Although The Age of Innocence isn't exactly autobiographical, there's a sense in which Newland Archer, the novelist's protagonist, played by Daniel Day-Lewis, shares Wharton's background, her isolation, passion for books and European culture, something of a misfit while at the same time embedded in the social conventions and hypocrisies of old New York. Wharton even changed his name from Langdon to Newland, which echoes her own middle name, Newbold. And at the end of the story, they're exactly the same age. That is, the age that she was when she wrote the novel is the exact same age that Newland Archer is at the end of the novel and the movie. But Wharton also embodies the other central character. She became a successful, productive version of Ellen Olenska, the love of Newland's life, played by Michelle Pfeiffer. Independent, a survivor of a disillusioning marriage, even living in the same neighborhood in Paris. Wharton loved to travel. She had a passion for the motor car in its earliest days, and she palled around not only with Henry James, who was 20 years her senior, but also with great art critics, Bernard Berenson, Kenneth Clark, and with Aldous Huxley. And I remember one story that her biographer, Hermione Lee, told me about how she mentioned to Henry James that with the proceeds from her next book, she would be able to buy a new automobile. To which Henry James said, well, with the proceeds of my next book, I'm going to be able to buy a cart that I can take down to the train station to wheel people's luggage up to my house. And with the proceeds from the next book, I'll have the funds to paint the cart. There was, I guess, a kind of not quite rivalry. They were actually very good friends. And Wharton secretly put money in Henry James's account because they had a common publisher. And he had no idea, and he once said to her, you know, he hadn't expected his royalties for that particular book to amount to so much. Surprisingly, given her genteel background and her image, Edith Wharton made more money from her writing than her inheritance. And also surprisingly, given her reputation as a somewhat snobbish aesthete, she threw herself into war work during the helping refugees in France during the First World War, taking charge of an orphanage of 600 children, organizing a workshop for unemployed women, and many more things. She was named a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor. And it was after the devastation of the First World War that Edith Wharton turned to the period of her New York childhood for her novel, The Age of Innocence. She wrote it quickly between September 1919 and March 1920. She wanted, she said, a momentary escape, feeling that she had to get away from the present altogether. It was an historical novel in that there was almost a 50-year gap between when she was writing and the time she was writing about, namely the early 1870s, apart from a brief coda at the turn of the century. The Age of Innocence won a Pulitzer Prize. It got rave reviews, with the New York Times declaring it her best book and one of the best books of the 20th century. She even sold the movie rights. There was a silent film in 1924 and another adaptation in 1934 starring Irene Dunne and John Bowles. Speaking of bests, Martin Scorsese is one of the great American filmmakers and film lovers of our time. He was born in New York in 1942, 80 years after Edith Wharton. He grew up in Little Italy, he studied cinema at NYU, and had enormous success almost from the beginning with Mean Streets, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Taxi Driver, New York, New York, The Last Waltz, and Raging Bull. And all of these were made while he was still in his 30s. I won't go through the whole list of his work, but cut to 1988 and The Last Temptation of Christ, 1990 and Goodfellas, and then 1993, The Age of Innocence. Edith Wharton wasn't what critics or the public were expecting from Scorsese. The New Yorker's Anthony Lane quipped that, given the emphasis on decor and dining, it was Raging Bull in a china shop. Scorsese says he was attracted to the novel's repressed emotion, forced restraint, and obsession. But how he came to read The Age of Innocence in the first place brings us to our very special guest tonight. I've admired Jay Cox ever since he was Time magazine's movie critic in the late 60s and early 70s. What I hadn't realized was that he crossed over to the other side, so to speak, almost from the beginning. Jay Cox was born in the Bronx in 1944. He started reviewing movies when he was a kid, using a typewriter that his father gave him and wearing a fedora because that's what he saw. He was modeling himself on journalists that he saw in the movies. He studied at Kenyon College in Ohio, where he wrote a movie review column for the college paper, and he took over the Film Society. When Jay was 23, in 1967, he got a job as a reporter at Time magazine, the first time they hired someone to cover the film industry. A year later, he met Martin Scorsese. I would say that the rest is history, but luckily for us, the rest is the evening before us. Please welcome Jay Cox.
This is Spectacular introduction. Thank you. I didn't know about that bathtub. I wish we'd put it in the movie.
It was on Chambers Street.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So
Go.
yep. There's so much going on in this film in terms of both spoken language and visual language, and I know you're responsible for the words, but can you tell me about that opening scene at the Opera House with the opera glasses? And Scorsese said it took him about a year to get it right.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that isn't written. Like the famous Steadicam shot in Goodfellas, there are certain things that inhabit a director's imagination that you can't capture or even suggest on the page. And the scene of the opera, which flabbergasted me when I first saw it, is one of those moments. When you write a movie, you're not doing a blueprint. You're doing a kind of catechism. But if you're lucky, as I've been with my friend Marty, you have a priest who can bring that faith to life. We learned early on, especially when I was a film critic and I was partly responsible for this sort of thing, you know, you can typecast directors the way actors can be typecast. And Marty was typecast as either a epic poet of violence, of urban ennui, or most significantly, the great poet of the Gavones on the corner, you know? You had to know him as I knew him, first as a friend, to know that he's a multifaceted gem. And The Age of Innocence was one of the first times that this almost secret facet of his was allowed to be expressed in a big film. It would also be Last Temptation, I think, would be another film like that. Films that reveal a side of him that remains unknown to people up until that point. It's not always a comfortable side, as those of you who've seen Silence know, but it is a profound and deeply personal side. And oddly enough, in this beautiful novel about a world that existed 20 blocks from where Marty lived, he found the vehicle for one of his most personal expressions.
Should we tell them about the cameo, to watch for the cameo? The Marty appears?
You can, well, I hope you've got better things to do than watch out for my cameo in the movie.
Oh, I didn't know you had a cameo.
Yeah, Marty.
I was going to tell you about Marty's
Our
cameo.
son, my son, Marty's godson, is in the movie. Marty's dog is in the movie. I'm happy to give you a little glossary of all the cameo
Where are you?
appearances. Marty and I both play photographers.
I saw him, I spotted him.
Yes. I am taking Winona's picture when she receives her archery award. And I can tell you, I was in heavy competition here with Daniel and Michelle and Winona and Alec McCowan, all these brilliant actors, Alexis Smith. And my contribution to this was growing sideburns.
It was a non-speaking role.
Unfortunately, yes, and I'll tell you why. So Marty installed me in this non-speaking role, and my sideburns were trimmed. I had a costume. I had a wonderful hat, which I'm still bitter they wouldn't let me keep. And I had to stand in front of this old plate camera with Winona, who teased me unmercifully about my tremendous discomfort in this scene. And I said to the AD, the assistant director, can I please have a line? I mean, I just something to miss. So if I'll speak, I could be more comfortable. Said, no, can't have a line. Why is that? We'll have to pay you more then. So I had to kind of bull my way through this scene. Finally, I heard cut, print, and I look over in the tent where Marty is hovering over the video monitor. And there he is, my best friend, America's greatest director of actors, going, my cameo.
Enjoy the movie.
Okay, see you later. Thank you.
I understand that you were urged to read The Age of Innocence when you were an undergrad, and you were told that it has the greatest last line in history. Tell me about that.
I don't know. She was different. That's my Daniel imitation. I'm afraid that's...
No, the last line.
Yes,
you
that's...
know the last line.
That's true.
Yeah, the last line.
I just I marvel at these actors every time I see this movie. I'm sorry, I get very involved in it emotionally, and I notice very small things, even though I was there every day on the set and I saw him do this. But the tiniest things on screen, something that I hadn't seen when he did it, the way he reaches up and takes Bobby Lyndon's hand like that in the room when they're first in Paris. It's a very small thing. The movement, the grace of it, and the emotion of it is just so extraordinary. That's his genius and Marty's genius to see that. Anyway, the last line.
Well, no, just when you first read the book,
Yeah.
the last line is,
As
if it had been the signal he waited for, Newland Archer got up slowly and walked back alone to his hotel.
No, the last line of dialogue. It was the last line of dialogue that what my friend...
Yes.
Let me give you a little... when I was a student at Kenyon, I had a very close friend who was a wizard English major, and he went to work at Life magazine, and I went to work at Life magazine, and he went on to be a journalist and then a novelist, and now teaches creative writing at Time. He knew at Kenyon, I'm sorry. There's no creative writing at Time magazine anymore. Anyway, he knew how to get a hook into me, and he said, have you ever read The Age of Innocence? And like all wise-off college kids, the only Edith Wharton book I'd ever read was Ethan Frome, because it was the shortest, right? And I said, no, I haven't. He said, it's got the greatest last line in American literature. I don't think he meant that literally, but he knew how to get, as I said, get the hook into me. So I read the book and was floored by it. And the last line he meant was, of course, tell her I'm old-fashioned. And it was that compelled me to almost instantly give the book to Marty. And I thought that it could be a film like some of the films that we admire so much. Specifically, I thought of two, The Leopard and the Magnificent Ambersons. And he read it and he'd never read it either, and was floored. We didn't know there had been two other versions of the book. We thought that we'd stumbled on rare treasure, and the arrangements to buy the book were quickly made, and we wrote the screenplay.
But as I understand, it happened a little more slowly than that. That you gave him the book in 1980 and said that if you
Really? Did it take that long?
Yeah,
Was it 1980? Really?
Yeah, that you said when you do your costume romance, do this, and then it took him about 7 years to get around to reading it.
I don't think I said that about the costume romance. I do remember talking about the Visconti and the Wells, though. So whatever, I thought it was much...
Well, the writing of the screenplay went very fast.
17 days.
And you did it together. And what was your process? How did you do that?
Oh, well, I know I'm so grateful that there are so many fans of this movie here, and I've told this story a lot. So for those of you who have heard it, excuse me. We both made sure to get, let me see your copy of the book. No, it wasn't that one. We got the same
It's the
trade
modern
paperback
library or
edition
something.
of The Age of Innocence. So we both were reading the same version of the novel. And so we would have the same page references and stuff when it came to writing the script. But we read it separately a week or so before we were about to sit down to actually write the script. And the first day of writing came. I went over to Marty's house, set up, and he has a standard line, like the first day of school. All right, let's open our books to page 1. So opened the books, and we're just kind of looking at each other, and he goes like that over at my book. And I kind of go sideways and look at his copy of the book, and he says, let's go to page 12. So we go to page 12, go through the same process. 44. 227. We calculated, in over 95% of the cases, each of us separately had underlined the same things. So that's the kind of, as I was telling a friend of mine earlier, that's the kind of closeness that goes beyond collaboration. I've collaborated with some wonderful filmmakers, but my work with Marty is special because he's been my best friend for 50 years. We're like brothers. At least I fancy we're like brothers. He has a brother already, so he might not agree, but I don't. And we seem to be able to finish each other's sentences and to know instinctively what the other is thinking and would like to realize. And that's how, one reason the script was written so fast. The process, the mechanical process, was pretty simple. I did 2 sets of cards. One was an outline, chapter by chapter, of what happens in the novel. The second set of cards was my suggestion about how the scenes could be arrayed in a dramatic narrative fashion. We laid all the cards out on the floor, and Marty would look at the synopsis. Then we together look at the suggested structure. We do a little card shuffling. But it shouldn't come as a surprise. In almost all cases, we never varied Mrs. Wharton's structure particularly. There was one sequence we cut, which was the wedding of May and Newland. It was cut for space and time and expense. It would have been a very, very big scene, a very expensive scene. And there was one dramatic structural problem with this great book as a narrative piece, as a dramatic piece. The problem was that it basically comes to a climax in the middle, and then you have to start building it up all over again. After this incredible scene, which I used to call the fulcrum scene between Daniel and Michelle, this raw...
The scene in the carriage.
No, before. The raw, desperate scene in her apartment when he goes down on her knees and kisses her foot. That was, I still think, one of the most challenging things Marty and I ever did. And I think that I thought that if that scene didn't work, the movie would fall apart. And to be perfectly, I think that it works beautifully. I think it's a stunning and audacious scene. I'm not totally sure that Marty feels that he realized it 100% or not, but certainly to my satisfaction, and I think and hope yours too, he did. Anyway, shortly after that, that's a climax. That's a huge climax. It comes about 90 minutes in, maybe. And so once again, you have to start the story up again. And removing the wedding allowed us to transition more quickly into the new build-up. That's the only major sequence, I think, from the book that's not in the film.
Scorsese said that The Age of Innocence was the most violent film he ever made. Now, And that, yes, and that while the surface is very different from his other movies, the situations and the interrelations are the same. As he put it, if someone has to be taken out, they're taken out. Now, I know he's responding to the surprise at his making this kind of a movie, but what do you think? Really? The most violent film he'd ever made? I mean,
Well, the emotional violence is extraordinary in this movie. And when you hear the narrator say he felt like a prisoner in the center of an armed camp, I mean, when people get in trouble on the streets, they go, as some gangsters say, down under. They go to Australia. Do you know that phrase? It means they're down under. That's what happens on the street, but you go on living, in a way, in this center of this armed camp. And that, in a way, is more violent and more terrible and racks you up emotionally for life. But yet, there's something more here, too. I mean, he did have, Newland Archer, made a decision that was compelled by conscience and enforced by circumstance. And he did lose something considerable. But his life was not an empty one. And through his sacrifice, there were young people who grew up to have their own fully realized lives through what he did. So, yes, what happened to him was incredibly violent. The subtlety and, dare I say it, the social grace of the violence is extraordinary. It's like the edge of a blade. But he did not sacrifice everything. And I think you could say that because of what he did give up, many people, including May, gained more than he lost.
You had the gift of Edith Wharton's dialogue, but you also had to make choices. And for instance, you made, I thought, a very elegant cut when Archer fantasizes an escape to a place where there would be no such categories as mistress, and Ellen says, "Oh my dear, where is that country?"
Yeah.
In the novel, she goes on to say, "I know so many who've tried to find it, and they all make a mistake at getting out at wayside stations at places like Bologna or Pisa or Monte Carlo, and it wasn't all that different from the old world they left behind." And so, but you knew just, "Oh my dear, where is that country?" Like the scene in the carriage you've described as the sexiest scene that Marty's ever done.
Well, I still believe that. And, you know, you were asking me earlier when we were introducing the movie about the difference between writing things and seeing them realized on screen. So that the brilliant opening scene in the opera basically appears in the script as a series of inserts and cuts, tie-pins, flowers, you know, it's just anything that we could think of. The rhythm and the sequencing of the images is all Marty. Just as in Goodfellas, the famous Steadicam shot appears in the script this way. They go into the Copacabana. So that's all in the brilliant realization of what he sees.
But here you knew just where to cut, and you knew just what was needed in terms of dialogue, and what should go.
How did I do that? I don't know. No, I think just because that line seemed so strong, and you do in film have to pick and choose. I mean, you were reading the rest of that brilliant speech, but there was no time for it, and it extrapolating on it seemed to drain the initial emotion of what she said.
Then there's the voiceover, Joanne Woodward's narrator. Did you both know from the start that you would use it?
Absolutely. Marty and I missed the class in film school where they tell you narration isn't cinematic. Other people who missed this class were Orson Welles, Stanley Kubrick. I could go on and on. I love narration in film. And from the very first, it seemed to us that the beauty, clockwork precision, and poetry of her language would add to the sensual fabric of the movie, would reinforce the beauty of the images, not cut against them. And we always wanted to use it. It was Marty's idea to do something even more unique. Now, I defer to some of you, but can anyone name me another film with a third-person narration read by a woman? I don't know of one. And that was Marty's idea to get Joanne. She was
But here,
incredible.
presumably, it's Edith Wharton? I mean, it's the...
No,
in
it's
that
not
sense?
necessarily
Not
Edith
necessarily?
Wharton. I think that he felt that there was something in the cadence and tone of her voice that fit the rhythm of this beautiful language. He didn't mean for her to be Mrs. Wharton. He meant just for her to be the voice of this time in this story.
In the book, May is fair and the Countess is dark, and of course it's flipped in the movie. And some of the regulars at Books on Film will recall when we had James Ivory here and with the film Morris, the same thing occurred. The in the novel, this character who's dark-haired is blonde in the movie, and vice versa. So are blondes just sexier?
When they're Michelle. But Winona is, she's just extraordinary. And if I think Marty had thought that was important, he would have changed it. But, when you do that with actors, you're asking them to dye their hair or wear a wig. And it's a kind of technicality that gets in the way of the honesty of the performance. You don't want to do it unless there's some heavily germane reason for one specifically to be fair and the other dark. And so there didn't seem to us to be any particular reason for that. And so we were just lucky to get these two extraordinary women.
I don't know if you know, just recently, in fact, a couple of days ago, the Guardian newspaper in England, for some reason, decided to, out of the blue, they had a feature on Winona Ryder's best and worst roles over her career. And out of 20, the best was Age of Innocence. In case you're curious.
Oh, she's...
The worst.
No, I didn't know about that, but she's...
Heather's was number 2.
Yeah.
Number 20, House of the Spirits.
Edward Scissorhands pretty good.
Yeah, no, it was in there.
Beetlejuice,
It was
you
in there.
know.
But no, it wasn't the movie, but it was her role, her playing.
Right.
Was-
Great Balls... No, I was talking about her roles in the movies.
Yeah, they gave Age of It as
Great
Innocence
Balls of
or
Fire
whatever.
and Heathers, I'd seen them both at a little theater in Maine within 2 or 3 weeks of each other, and I called Marty and I said, this girl, she's incredible. What do you think? And he said, I'm on it. Yeah, you can't get ahead of him, but he was already there with that.
Daniel Day-Lewis famously inhabits his roles before shooting. What did he do for The Age of Innocence?
Practically everything. It was a little, he wanted to stay in a hotel or in a building of that time. And so he stayed in the Lowell Hotel, if any of you know New York, and it's a kind of now what they call a boutique hotel on 63rd Street between Madison and Park. We had to import colognes for him from England, from Trumpers or someplace on German Street. And he would, other than that, I mean, he was very punctilious about costume. He worked very, very hard on the accent with a great friend of ours named Tim Monick, who's worked on a lot of Marty's movies. Very, very hard, and listened I think I'm going to get this right. Tim found a recording of Theodore Roosevelt, and I think Daniel listened over and over again to Theodore Roosevelt's New York honk, that accent that people of that class had at that time, and emulated it to a certain extent in this. You can see his posture is different, the way he sits is different, and the only thing that's the same between Daniel's performance is his shameless emotional nudity. He will just, when I was looking at him sitting on the bench with the tears in his eyes, dreaming of her turning to him.
That was an addition.
That I did that, yeah, in a way that would have changed his life and everybody's life forever. I just looked in his eyes, and I'm glad it's a movie, because if it was real life, you would have looked away. It was so intense and so beautiful. By the way, with Thelma Schoonmaker, our great friend and Marty's fabulous wizard editor, tells me that when Daniel first saw this movie, when it ended, she held him in her arms for 20 minutes while he wept.
So about that ending, some critics feel that Edith Wharton's own unfulfilled and fleeting romance with Morton Fullerton, because of that, she chose unfulfillment for her lovers in The Age of Innocence, that's what life is like. How do you understand his not going upstairs?
Well, I can tell you an anecdote about it. Maybe this will explain. The only disagreement Marty and I had during the writing of this, we've never had a fight, we've never had an argument, but the only disagreement we had was about the ending. In the book, Archer gets up and leaves. Marty thought it would be more emotional if he remained seated. I said, gee, I don't know. I think you've got to sort of be definitive. He said, no, I think let people feel it in themselves. It's so poignant, it's heartbreaking. And since he's the guy who's going to have to stage the scene, at a certain point you just go with his instinct. Also, he's Marty, so you know you're in good hands. Anyway, we began the shoot up in Albany, outside Albany in New York. And we were all staying at a motel, and the night before the motel, I ran into Michael Bauhaus, the now departed genius cinematographer, and he said, I loved your script. It was one of the greatest scripts I ever read. I said, oh, gee, wow, thank you. That's great. And he said, and you know what my favorite part was? I said, no. He said, when he's just sitting there on the bench at the end. So I sort of went, oh, that's great. Yeah, thanks. And he said, yes, because you think there's always a chance that he'll go up after all. I said, yeah, all right, great. Oh, thank you, Michael. See you tomorrow. So I went and knocked on Marty's door and gave him a hug for luck the next day. And I said, I ran into Michael and he really loved our script. And Marty said, oh, yeah, I know, that's great. And I said, you know what? I said, you know what he really liked about it? He liked it that Newland Archer was still on the bench and might go upstairs. And Marty looked at me and said, no fucking way. Does that answer your question?
But Edith Wharton is somewhat more critical of Newland Archer, a little more satirical of the new man who believes in divorce and who believes women should have equal rights and then doesn't act. Marty, if I may call him that, has said that you and he were more sympathetic, more empathetic to him.
Oh, totally. I think we understand about guilt, repression, all that good stuff. A lot of drama comes out of that. I actually never thought that she was, I never would have thought that she was being satirical, but that may be just the way we read her. I always thought that he was striving to understand, kind of like what the narrator says about May, that her whole world crumbled around her and started to reassemble, and she never knew. He knew. He saw the changes. He knew the changes and was reaching out and trying to adapt, or at least understand. But the conclusion he came to was, for him, definitive. Tell her I'm old-fashioned.
Okay, we have to go back to how you met Martin Scorsese.
Well, I was a green reporter for Time magazine. I've been hired to report on cinema. And although there was a lot of cinema to report on, there wasn't a lot of space in the magazine for my reports. So they didn't know basically what to do with me, and I kept being threatened to get transferred to the Bangkok bureau or something where I could get some good journalistic seasoning. I was not equipped for anything except movies. And one day my editor came down the corridor waving a copy of the New York Times Sunday magazine saying, "What the hell are these student filmmakers?" Now this is 1968, I think, when the idea of going to school to learn how to make movies was faintly reasonable. It was like going to a vocational school to learn how to be a car mechanic or something. Nevertheless, this was starting to be a hot topic, and my editor said, let's do a story about student filmmakers. So I had to find a student filmmaker. Called a friend of mine from Kenyon who was working in Mike Wadley's editing room. Name Mike Wadley mean anything to you? Guy who made Woodstock. He was a wonderful documentary filmmaker. And my friend who was working there said, well, Mike, I don't know any student filmmakers either, but Mike lets this guy use his screening room after his editing room after hours. He's working on a first feature. I've seen little bits of it. It looks very good. He just was a student. Now he's a teacher at NYU. Why don't I give you his name? The name was Marty Scorsese. And I met him in the winter of 1968. I took him out to a Time magazine expense account lunch. We shook hands. We sat down at the table. We started to talk about movies. 3 hours later, we were still talking. It was like the Corsican brothers. It was like two guys who were separated at birth, who finally found each other. And our friendship was instantaneous from that moment. And we started talking about movies, dreaming about movies, planning movies from that point on. About 6 or 8 weeks later, I made my first trip to Los Angeles. And at that time, having met my first student filmmaker, Marty, I met my first professional card-carrying filmmaker, Stanley Kubrick. And I spent 3 weeks with him while he was finishing 2001, but that's a story for another time. And it wasn't until recently that I looked back and thought to myself, how lucky can you get? But that's how I met Marty.
I understand that
Sadly, Marty and Stanley never met, although they did speak from time to time.
I understand that Marty came with you on your first date with your future wife, the actress Verna Bloom.
That's correct. 3 people on the first date. Me, my brother, and Verna. And where did we go? To the movies. What did we went to a screening. We went to a screening of a film by Susan Sontag called Duet for Cannibals. There were 3 people in the screening room. 2 of us fell asleep. Guess who stayed awake and found something good to like about the movie?
Marty, obviously, yeah.
Of course.
Because you married Verna. You get a special thanks for Mean Streets, 1973. What was your involvement?
Boy, that's a question I don't get answered on. The title.
I'm sorry? You gave him the title?
Which comes from Raymond Chandler. And that was we were sitting in the producer's rented house in Laurel Canyon. And I suggested this title. And John Taplin, the producer, said, boy, that's great. And Marty said, yeah, that's really good, but does it seem like it's kind of patronizing or something? I don't want to seem like I'm putting people down in the neighborhood. And I said, no, I just think it's beautiful language and a beautiful title, and he went with it. But I think it's very interesting that his first reaction was a
Not
kind
to
of
disrespect.
caring for the people who had inspired the movie in a certain way. The structure at the beginning of the movie, the introduction of the 4 characters, I believe was my idea. And the voiceover at the beginning, Marty was going to cut that. You don't make up for your sins in the church, you make up for it in the streets, et cetera, et cetera. I suggested putting that over a black screen. So those were a few of my contributions.
In 1977...
And my
yes.
wife, Verna, helped Marty get the financing for that movie. Verna, my wife, introduced Marty to Bob De Niro, and she helped him get financing from Mean Streets. So she's a very important part of this whole
So it's a good thing
story.
you went on that triple date.
A very good thing for both of us, actually. As it turns out, yeah.
In 1977, you left Time magazine for a year to go to Los Angeles to write what was to be the first of many drafts of Gangs of New York. What was that like for you?
What was writing?
What was
Gangs of New York?
and how did that come about that you went to LA to spend
Well,
to devote yourself to
in the early 70s, Marty and I and Verna would always spend Christmas together. And we spent Christmas, and then he went off for New Year's somewhere, and he called me New Year's Day to say Happy New Year. And he said, I'm standing in he was calling from a phone in a library at his house where he was staying. And he said, there's this book on the bookshelf called Gangs of New York. Have you ever heard of that? And I was standing in my little office at this railroad flat we had, and I said, I'm looking at my copy on a shelf right now. That's another example of this synchronicity. And that's how Gangs of New York began.
That was a nonfiction book, I think.
That's a nonfiction book, although heavily fictive in its factual retelling, I think.
You wrote around a dozen drafts for Gangs of New York over the 25 years that it took to get made.
I did, and then Marty and I did, yep.
You were fired by Harvey Weinstein.
That's right.
What happened?
I'm going to say something dangerous here. Thank you very much. In no way to minimize the horror this pig visited on dozens of women. He did the same thing to artists of either gender. He ruined their films. His power move on women was exactly like his power move on filmmakers. He raped them. And that's about all I've got to say about that. He's the biggest lowlife I ever met.
You want to talk about the writing of Gangs of New York? I mean, before
And
his
furthermore,
before his intervention. I mean, what happens over like such because the same, not the same thing,
well,
but
you kind of,
spending 25 years.
Gangs of New York was actually this huge undertaking, and it was a very, very expensive proposition. From the get-go, it was a massive movie. It was meant to be scaled like that. And Marty, before I began the first draft, Marty said to me, just think of it as a Western on Mars. And that's kind of what it is, if you stop to think about it. Harvey, I always thought, we were making fine progress with the script together. But Harvey came on board. He allowed the movie, or he got the movie made. He got the money. So he deserves big props for that from all of us. But his first move was to Bigfoot it into the enterprise, and he did it in the classic way of firing the writer. And that's what he did. He fired me. That was a difficult moment for both me and Marty, but it didn't affect our friendship an iota. And then Steve Zalian came to work on it, did some work on it. and then left because, well, you have to ask Steve about that sometime. I'm not exactly sure why he left. And then Kenny came on, Kenny Lonergan.
Kenneth Lonergan, yeah. You also worked with Marty on The Last Temptation of Christ, though the screen credit ultimately went to Paul Schrader. What was that process like for you?
The credit process?
No, working on the writing of The Last Temptation.
Well, it was the old open your books to page 1. I used to make fun of the book because it's. Any of you know the book?
Nikos Kazantzakis,
yeah,
The Last Temptation.
It's a wonderful book, but it seems, at least in its translation, to be kind of very hyperbolic, or if I might politely say, overwritten. So it has to be radically distilled. And Paul Schrader, who did one draft, is extraordinarily gifted in finding the narrative spine in something. He's really paring things down. Excuse me. And what Marty and I did was kind of add things on to Paul's initial draft. We did about, 12, 14 drafts, and he did one. But according to the Writers Guild, some of you may know this, in order to receive a co-writing credit, the Writers Guild says you've got to change a minimum of 50% of the structure of a story. Dialogue basically doesn't count. You can rewrite 80% of the dialogue, and it doesn't really count for credit. Crazy as that seems. It's like saying it doesn't make any difference what people say. Nevertheless, that's there. You've got to change the structure. And I said, well, we couldn't change the structure. The structure is the Bible story, basically, with this dream sequence at the end. Come on. But I'm afraid that argument didn't cut it.
Another epic journey was Silence, adapted from Shusaku Endo's novel.
Is it tomorrow already? Or are we?
No. It's just the process with Marty about Jesuit priests in 17th century Japan. It just came out in 2016. It was 26 years in the making.
Mm-hmm.
You began work on it not long after the release of The Last Temptation of Christ, which was 1988. You started working on it in 1989.
Right.
In what way was it a reaction to that film?
A reaction to Last Temptation? Well, I think it was kind of a closing. Last Temptation was the opening of a parenthesis, and Silence was a closing. I think they're two movies about the rigors and glories of faith and belief. I told Marty that The Last Temptation of Christ was the first movie he ever made with a happy ending.
Last Temptation was with that?
Yeah. Resurrection, that's... So, but yes, both movies end up being affirmations in a way that I hope is not glib. And in that, they are kind of bookends around Marty's journey of faith and my bumbling along behind him.
Endo's novel was very complicated. You went through dozens of drafts. How did your collaboration work on this one?
Pretty much the same way, although it was spaced out over a far longer period of time. Same technical process, 2 sets of cards, same edition of the book, underlinings, but much different in that the book, the Endo novel, is translated. I was going to say, it's not gracefully translated. That caused us a lot of problems. The novel also, it seemed to have some kind of printing problems in it, where episodes from one chapter seemed to somehow show up in the following chapter when they should have been in the preceding one. It was very baffling. I don't think it was a novel that was rendered into English and printed with great care. Along with that and the infacility of the language, the novel takes place in 3 different voices. There's third-person narration, first-person voice, and there's an epistolary ovulary in their diaries, letters, public papers. And so the challenge there was to take the germane material in each of those voices and translated it into a single forward-moving dramatic voice. That was the difference. With Wharton, it kind of, everything was there. I mean, it was just ripe for the picking.
You've worked with many other filmmakers. You've come to know many other filmmakers as well as Marty. For instance, as you mentioned, Stanley Kubrick. We won't go into the whole story of 2001, but you did help Kubrick get the rights for Eyes Wide Shut.
Boy, you're really good with the research.
How did that happen?
Well, I got very, very friendly with Stanley. I was young. I was impressionable. He was a fabulous character. I can tell you only that if he were sitting here today instead of me, and I wish that could be, you would find him to be affable, approachable, funny, brilliant, and you could forget all this mad genius stuff about him. He was like me, a Bronx boy. I think we kind of bonded on that, and we struck up a real friendship. Now, I was a young guy working for Time, and I could do Stanley a lot of good, and I think he was quite aware of that. But past all that, I think that he was genuinely fond of me and liked me as this young kind of film kid who really knew film. He came to me and said, we were talking about future movies, and he said, you ever heard of Arthur Schnitzler? I said, yeah, I know. Laurent, I know Laurent. He said, yeah. He said, have you ever heard of a novel called Rhapsody? He said, why don't you get that and read it? It's pretty interesting. So I went out to the Argosy used bookstore, and I found an old copy of this book from 1929. And it is this strange, powerful book, Rhapsody, a dream novel. And he said, I want to do this someday. I got to buy the rights. He said, you know, if they know I want to buy it, they're going to charge me a lot of money. Why don't you buy it and I'll pay you back? So I said, really? Okay. How do we do that? And he gave me an idea, and he put me in touch with his lawyer, this very sharp, sweet guy. And he taught me the basic steps. And I'm sorry, Henry Luce and all the editors of Time Magazine, I took out a piece of Time Magazine stationery and wrote to the estate and said, I am a young film critic who would like to make film. And Rhapsody, a dream novel, has come to my attention. And with the input of Stanley's lawyer, we struck a deal for me to buy the novel outright, I believe, and for what we can say, should we say, is a price that a struggling young film critic could afford. I immediately sold it to Stanley for $1, and that's how we got the rights to Rhapsody, a dream novel. The other thing I did was he was very interested in exploring kind of the outer reaches of personal cinema, shall we say. And there was a performance artist who had made some erotic films. Her name was Carolee Schneemann. Does that sound familiar to anybody? And I got a hold of a movie of hers called Fuses, which had lots of solarized color and multiple cuts and deliberate scratches on the film, and many scenes of her screwing her boyfriend very energetically. And I said, well, Stanley, you know, he said, take a look at that. Let me know what it's like. I said, well, this is what's going on. He said, yeah, I'd like to see that. So I said, okay. So I set up a screening at Time Magazine in a small conference room. And Carolee Schneemann insisted on coming when she knew that it was Stanley who was going to see the movie. So it was me, Stanley, and Carolee Schneemann in this movie, in this little conference room, watching this movie. Now remember, please, this is 1969, so this is way before people dropping their own erotic memoirs in video on the internet. And Stanley sat and watched this acrobatic display of sexual calisthenics, really very, very good. And the lights came up, and of course, we've just beheld this very intimate thing. And he said, Stanley had this characteristic gesture. We always wore a blue blazer, and he had this gesture. He'd kind of sit up in his seat and fold his blazer over. So there was this long silence, and he said, geez, Carol Lee, and he did that thing with his jacket. He said, how'd you get that shot in the bed there? And that was sort of the beginning of the erotic part of Eyes Wide Shut. She told him how she got it. He was very interested.
You've said you see parallels between Eyes Wide Shut and The Age of Innocence.
Did I say that?
Yeah, you said they're both about male panic and weakness.
Male panic, yeah. Well, I don't know. Maybe being a little glib there. Do you think that? I don't know if Newland Archer is riddled with panic. He's certainly very anxious. He's certainly eager to break the chains of the society that he believes is confining him. But I wouldn't say that he was really panicked, would you? Panicked?
No, that's what I wanted to ask you.
Okay, rewrite my quote.
I'll rewrite your
It's not
quote.
yet.
Okay, we're going to open to questions from the audience. Please wait for the microphone to come
And
to
Harvey
you.
Weinstein, if you're out there, stand up and take a bow.
Hello? Oh, sorry.
Yes, hi.
Hi, thanks. About the voiceover, I just wanted to say I love the voiceover so much because it's the thing that gives you the time to be the tourist. Because whenever it's in place, it's this long, beautiful voice, but you're usually taking a tour of the set at that point, right? So I enjoy that very much. When you asked about the female narrator, so I was hearing something in my head and I finally got it, and it was the adult scout in To Kill a Mockingbird. She does a long intro and then the extra at the end.
Yeah, but she's a character in the movie.
Right, but she's, well, okay, I thought it was like a...
No, I said
You
a-
meant
He
to
said
sort
a
of...
third-person
Oh, a third
narrator.
person,
He
I'm
made
sorry.
it a very narrow...
say the way
Darn
Orson
it, I
Welles.
thought that was
you know
a
the
good
way
answer.
Orson Welles narrates. The way
Okay.
Orson Welles narrates Ambersons or Michael
Sure.
Hord narrates Barry Lyndon.
I understand.
But that's a really good point. You're right. But even that way, you don't hear it very much. Even when there are major female characters in a movie, you don't hear their voice narrating, hardly ever. It also reminds me that, I think that the glories of 20th century American literature should not be seen exclusively as a men's club. I know there are these many genius writers, but two of them, had Willa Cather and Edith Wharton been men, would have stood side by side with Hemingway and Faulkner and Fitzgerald and the others, I do believe. I hope that comes right sometime. And it would be a great thing to make a movie of a great Willa Cather movie someday. There have been very few. Have you ever seen My Mortal Enemy? Have you ever read My Mortal Enemy? Nah.
I just want to say thank you for. Am I next?
Yep.
Okay. I want to say thank you for bringing this film here. It's one of my very favorite films, and I also saw that you were involved with Strange Days and are a credited screenwriter on that, and one of my other favorite films. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that collaboration as well.
I can't see you with the light. Where are you?
Oh, hello.
Oh, there you are. Hi.
That was Catherine Bigelow's
That's
film.
that was a very different kind of collaboration. I got a call from my agent at the time. Said, Catherine Bigelow wants to meet you. I said, wow, that's great. She wants to make a movie about Joan of Arc. I said, oh, God, really? I mean, really? And my agent, a shrewd guy, said to me, no, don't worry. She read Gangs of New York. She loves it. She said, do Joan of Arc that way. Just think of it as Gangs of New York where the chick gets burned at the stake. That was my agent's line. So I said, okay, I'll come on out. So I meet Catherine. We hit it off great. We start working on this Joan of Arc piece, which was called Company of Angels. In the meantime, her newly estranged husband, Jim Cameron, has this other movie that he wanted to give her called Strange Days. And it was written in the form of what Jim calls a scriptment, which is a little bit of script and a lot like a treatment. It's basically like the length of a novella. And Catherine was so pleased with our work together that she asked Jim if I could work on Strange Days with her because he was off making True Lies. So he said, oh, well, okay, that's your call. And so we went to work on, put Joan of Arc aside, and went to work on Strange Days. And I worked off of this scriptment, like a novella, and put it into script form. The structure was very much Jim, still. I must have moved a month of the structure around to get a credit from the Writers Guild. I don't actually remember. But we had a grand time making that. It's a movie I'm very proud of, too. And it's still, I don't know, the last time I saw it, it's still a deeply troubling movie, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, Catherine's really great, really great.
So way in the back.
Oh, hi, Jay. I was just wondering, what are some other projects that you and Scorsese were thinking about and were sort of close to getting towards making, but for some reason just never worked out? Like, I know you guys were thinking about doing a Philip K. Dick novel once, and
yeah, that's there. There aren't any unrealized movies that we've tried to do that haven't yet been done, which is probably a good thing, because if we started one now, the way we go, takes a quarter of a century, we'll both be dead. So back in the early days when we were first starting to write together, and this is when I was still a film critic, we would work up in my office at the time, and I hasten to assure you all that I never reviewed any movies made by my friends, which was tough luck for Marty and Brian De Palma and George Lucas and all our other crowd, because a lot of the times the critics who did review them at times didn't like them. So Marty and Brian were paying a heavy price for being my friend. Anyway, we found this book called Time Out of Joint by Philip K. Dick, and it had a great setup, like many science fiction stories, great premise. And the premise, for those of you who don't know the book briefly, is that there's this kind of 9-to-5 office worker who comes home to a vine-covered cottage with a white picket fence and a nice, I think his sister and her husband and their kids and stuff, and he's kind of living in a spare room. It's all very 50s, very Robert Young, Jane Wyatt. And he walks in the front hall. This was in our script, I think. And hangs his coat up on the hook, and the coat and hook disappear. And in their place is this little slip of paper that says, coat hook. And he goes in and has dinner, and he starts to eat, and the dinner disappears, and there's something there in place of the plate that says, dinner plate. It was like The Truman Show 25 years before The Truman Show. The problem with this was, not the setup, which was a lot of fun, and we had a lot of fun with it. We put in a laugh track like a TV sitcom. It was revealing what was going on. And for all the imagination of the setup, the reveals in these things are very often so pedestrian, and I'm afraid this was too. And we couldn't think of another better way to do it. The reveal in Time Out of Joint was that this fellow who was living in the house was a nuclear physicist, I believe, who was working on a missile defense system to protect the Earth because the Martians were about to invade. And Marty and I looked at each other and we said, we're not really Martian invader kind of guys. We love those movies. They're a lot of fun, but it's not us. It reminded me something that Marty said to me years ago that was one of the best pieces of advice I ever got. We were talking about our shared love for lurid horror movies. And I said, boy, wouldn't it be fun, the way John Ford used to go off and make a Western, just to make a Hammer vampire movie? And Marty looked at me and said, it would be, but you know what? You can't always make what you love. And that was the case with Time Out of Joint. We couldn't find a better resolution for it. Basically, this whole life that had been set up for this nuclear physicist was so that he would not have a nervous breakdown and could continue to work happily and securely on this missile defense system. How many of you are sorry we never made that movie?
One more up there.
How has your experience writing film informed your ability to critique film?
Couldn't hear that. Could you say it again?
How has your experience writing film informed your ability to critique film?
How
For my ability to
critique films?
How much is your experience? A long time ago.
Nice, cool.
It's a. Do you know the Asphalt Jungle? Well, I think it's John McIntyre plays the police commissioner. Refers to crime as a left-handed form of human endeavor. I feel a little bit the same way about movie critics, including a lot of the stuff that I wrote. I never considered myself a critic. I was always a reviewer, and to me that's a very important distinction. Reviewers being the guys and the people on the front line who give an instant, informed opinion and then kind of move on. Critics are the ones who write what Preston Sturges used to call the deep dish essays in the New York Review of Books. I was never that. It did teach me, being a critic taught me a way to analyze what I was doing and what was proposed to me by anybody whose business it was to make suggestions about the script, whether it was the producer or the filmmaker I was working with. So it gave me that kind of analytical distance. But I read a quote of Robert Altman's, or was attributed to Robert Altman the other day. He said, critics are like spectators at a battle who are up on a hill looking at the fight in the valley below, and then when the fight's over, they go down and shoot the survivors.
Last question. Who has them? No, you need a mic.
Over here?
Yep.
Thank you very much. I loved the scene at the end, and I found it very strong.
Sorry, it's already gone up. Where are you?
Right here.
Okay.
Right there or here?
Okay, up at the top.
All right, is that all right?
Okay. Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
I'd love to hear your insight into the scene at the end when Archer and her son are walking and they're talking about May and her comment. I just thought her strength suddenly came through. She had seemed like such a character who just let life happen. And suddenly it seemed that she got it all and she had supported him. And I just love to hear your insight into that conversation around that part of the script.
Well, what Ted tells him comes as a tremendous surprise to Newland Archer. That's another great Daniel moment. She never told me. She never told me. It shows, and again, this is Mrs. Wharton. That's not us. It's the way she could pace out revelation for not only maximum dramatic effect, but for maximum psychological impact as well. And that moment when Newland understands that she knew what he had done and saw it in a perspective that he never expected, further reinforces his sense of detachment. I don't mean emotional detachment. but his sense that he didn't fully understand what was happening in his life, even as it was happening. A sense that I share every day. I don't know about you, but...
Okay, this is the last question.
The last
Tracy.
one. Thank you
Yes.
very much. Thank you. And seeing the film again, I was even more impressed by the opulent cinematography. And my question is, you said it was shot in Albany. Was the whole film
No, the last part was shot, that's the last part of the movie was shot in Paris. A lot of the early New York stuff was shot, the exteriors were in Albany.
And Troy, New York, I think?
Albany and Troy, yeah. Let's see, most of the studio stuff, there for some reason, we went to Philadelphia for a couple of days to shoot in a theater, I think.
The Opera House, I think.
Yes, that's it. That's it, the Opera House. But there was some other little studio that we used as an insert. Most of it was shot in the Kaufman Astoria studios in New York, where I believe they made The Cosby Show. And the cinematographer was the great Michael Ballhaus, who worked on many movies with Marty.
And the interiors?
All studio. Some of the houses were houses in Albany that were redecorated by Dante Ferretti. This was the first of many movies that he worked on with Marty. Dante did Gangs, among other things.
I'd like to thank Jay Cox for coming and speaking to us this evening.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much for coming this season, and hope to see you next year.